They had claimed that I had no reason to be a TCH, that I had lied about getting access to the TCH medical record system in order to uh, access patient information. Um, so that first indictment came out in June of 2024, and they had detailed all of their charges, and they had called me a liar. It said I had deceived the hospital, that I had released and disclosed patient information. But that entire story that they painted was completely false. And it only took my lawyers a few weeks, right, to prove that everything they said in their indictment was a complete fabrication. And we knew it was a fabrication because the evidence that the Department of Justice gave us in discovery, right, had disproved every single allegation in their indictment. And it's worth restating that. The Department of Justice's own evidence disproved their own allegations. So how is it possible that the Department of Justice had charged me with these crimes?
In May of 2023, Christopher Rufo reported at City Journal on documents showing that despite public statements that they had stopped performing transgender medical interventions, the Texas Children's Hospital in Houston, the largest in the United States, had secretly continued. My guest today is Eithan Haim, the surgeon who provided those documents and became the subject of a whistleblower prosecution by the Biden Justice Department. Dr. Haim, welcome to the podcast.
How are you? Yeah, thank you for having me on.
For listeners who have never heard your story, can you just fill us in a bit on your background before you became a surgeon?
Well, yeah, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for listening. But yeah, my name is Eitan Haim. It's spelled, my first name is spelled Ethan. It's a Hebrew name, but it's spelled in German phonetics. Um, my dad's from Israel. My mom's from Germany. They met in Israel when my mom moved there when she was in her early 20s, and they moved to the United States in like the mid 1980s. And my brother and I were born in New York, and we had kind of your ideal upbringing in the suburbs outside of Orlando. I'm still very close with my family, and growing up, I got to see my dad's interactions as a doctor with his patients. My dad's a pulmonologist and he does critical care. So, whenever we would go out, go to the mall or like a supermarket, every once in a while, one of my dad's patients would come up to him, and they would have like this really special interaction, where these people would say, "Oh, like thank you so much for what you did to help me through my hospitalization, and you saved my life." And I remember thinking to myself, like that had a really big impact. And it was a part of my dad I had never seen. So, but growing up, there's kind of like that initial rebellious phase. So I went to college originally to do music, but I realized that wasn't for me, and then went into medicine, did medical school at Florida Atlantic University, and then did my surgical training at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. But yeah, I would say, it was a very kind of standard upbringing where my, parents really made a point to instill values in me to make sure I worked hard, and that I understood the value of earning your place in society.
Before you became a whistleblower, but while you were becoming a surgeon, what were your thoughts or feelings on pediatric gender transition? How did this situation come up on your radar, and what were you thinking about it when it came up?
It's pretty interesting because I honestly I didn't know anything about it. So I started my surgical training in 2018, and COVID happened in 2020, when the entire medical profession changed. That was like the year of like alpha for like the change in the medical profession for me. But before then, I kind of knew about these gender interventions in children with Jazz Jennings. But it was always kind of a fringe issue. I didn't know that it was very common. It didn't seem like it was happening to that many children. So it was just one of those things that existed that I didn't really put much thought into. I thought it was pretty crazy, but that was kind of it. I didn't really think deeply into it. It was only after COVID, after, in 2021, 2022, that I really woke up to the dangers of the transgender ideology and how much it had infiltrated into medicine. Because, you know, my views on the transgender issue really go back to COVID because, I was able to see the medical profession as a trainee before and after. And, for those who aren't familiar, residency is a time after medical school when you're training in a specific field of medicine. So for me, that was general surgery. And I was training in Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, which is one of the best surgery training programs in the country. So I was working with some of the best surgeons in the entire field, people who write the textbooks for surgical oncology and trauma surgery and everything. And after COVID started, I was able to see all the people I looked up to, the people who I saw as like surgical titans, the people who I aspired to be like, how they turned into a shell of their former selves, where they had adopted like the precepts of COVID, the masking, the social distancing, the contact tracing, the mRNA jabs, the kind of totalitarian components of the COVID ideology, and they did it without question. And so it really changed my perception on the field of medicine itself because I always had so much respect for it, where I thought like these people are the leading edge of medicine. They're ethical, they're good doctors, they're the ones who are leading our country, and I wanted to be like them. But then after COVID started, just to see these people give up on their principles and bow down to something that was obviously wrong had changed my entire perspective in the most radical way possible. Because all of it really resulted in patients being harmed. And as a trainee, right, I'm at the bottom of the totem pole and I have the most interactions with the patients, right? So I was able to see the effect that lockdowns was having on young children and what it was like for families not to be able to see their loved ones when they were passing away. And, so it was just hundreds of people who were being harmed in the most horrific ways possible. And no one was saying anything about it because they were being intimidated. So it was like being forced to work in an environment where the prevailing the prevailing uh, uh, sense is distrust of dogma, of like, you have to submit to, the expert opinion, and if you don't, you'll be destroyed. And that was when our country had really turned upside down. I mean, in almost every aspect, politically, medically, scientifically, your relationships with your neighbors, everything was colored through these crazy interactions based on this absurd dogma. And then it was in that setting that the gender ideology had um, come to light. How I came to kind of understand how dangerous it was. And it all started with, seeing videos from libs of TikTok and these crazy teachers and these doctors. And the ones in early 2022 from Massachusetts General, from Boston Children's Hospital, where they were talking about doing gender affirming hysterectomies and mastectomies in children. And, around that time that, I was becoming more senior surgical resident. So it was the most horrifying thing to think that you had surgeons who were doing the most radical surgeries on children who had no capacity to understand the consequences for what was happening. And it was all in the service of something that wasn't even true, right? Because it's not even possible for these kids to change their sex, and they're being told that if you don't do this, if you don't buy into this lie, that you're going to kill yourself, which is the most insane thing you could ever tell a child and their confused parents.
I'll tell you very briefly an anecdote. I walked past the entrance of Vanderbilt Children's Hospital with Billboard Chris in 2023. And there was a nurse who is there outside the hospital in her scrubs. I say nurse. I assume she was a nurse. I don't actually know what her medical position was, but she struck me as having nurse energy, and you probably know what I mean by that.
Yeah,
But
I know exactly what you mean.
she turned to walk towards us when she saw us so that she could walk past us at a certain distance of about 10 feet and whisper thank you to us. And I thought, how much horror is going on in the abattoir that she feels compelled to say thank you to us like that? So let me ask you, you're a surgeon, and surgeons do kind of have to play God. I'm sorry to use that phrase, but if you are palpitating somebody's heart with your gloved hand, you are kind of being God right there. You have to be incredibly self-confident to do that. You cannot second guess yourself. So being the first surgeon that I have interviewed, can you explain just where your profession lost its ethical way trying to cosmetically alter kids for adult purposes?
Yeah, and I think that, what you had said about doctors believing they can play God is one of the aspects that's really driving it, because the way I see it is that, I'm a my work has to do with healing God's creations. So I don't play God, I don't control the rules that he has, instituted to govern this world. I simply work with God's creations in order to restore health. So he's the one who sets the laws, right? It's our job to identify those laws and be able to use our skills to restore health. But one of the main problems with the field of surgery is that there's a growing belief that we are able to create something new, that we don't have to abide by the laws of biology, that the laws are whatever we say they are. And like, for example, when you look at COVID, it's like, um, with masks, right? Masks were obviously ineffective, but because all the experts said they were effective, that was what they would use to establish what was true. But truth doesn't come from a consensus. It comes from our observations of reality. And in the surgical profession, there's more and more people who believe that the truth comes from consensus rather than observation of objective reality. Like in my own practice, I do a lot of hernias, appendectomies, gallbladder surgery, colon cancer, emergency surgery. I know what I'm doing is helping people because I see them before, during, and after, right? Before they come to me in my clinic with a problem, I operate on them and then they get better, right? They can go back to their regular life. Like that's like the end result you want to produce. But in the field of surgery, it's like the creation of patients to enter the medical system to um, kind of serve these synthetic goals like gender affirming care and creating chronic medical patients without really restoring health of our patients.
After the story broke, Texas legislators passed a bill to end the practice of pediatric transition in the state. So, for a week or so, You were perhaps thinking, this is over. I did a good thing. I can move on. Um, and then federal agents show up and knocking on your door with questions. And an assistant U.S. attorney is threatening you with prosecution. And like the typical honest man in such a situation, you're too happy to talk because you think, I have nothing to hide. And it's your wife, Andrea, who intervenes, who says, stop talking, hire a lawyer. And this is the plot twist. Your wife is, or was, a federal prosecutor in Texas's Northern District, I believe, while you were being prosecuted in the Southern District. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And it's actually even crazier than that because so as a resident of Baylor College of Medicine in general surgery, one of the hospitals we work at the most is Texas Children's Hospital. It's one of the sister hospitals of Baylor College of Medicine, the academic surgery program. And it really is, it's an amazing hospital. They do amazing work, but the administration has lost their minds and the leadership of the medical staff, these people have adopted some really crazy ideologies. Um, but yeah, so in March of 2022, the hospital had released a statement unequivocally saying that they were going to shut down their transgender program because a few weeks before, in I think early March, February 2022, the Texas Attorney General had issued an opinion saying that these interventions could be investigated as child abuse. So it kind of makes sense that like soon after TCH would say, "Hey, we're not doing this anymore." They want to kind of take their hospital out of the spotlight just to avoid scrutiny from the AG's office. And it's kind of like what we're seeing today, with all the hospitals across the country saying that they're shutting down the programs. But what actually happened is that they didn't stop the program, they continued it. 3 days after that statement, they were doing surgeries on 11, 12-year-old kids to insert puberty blockers. So they not only continued the program after that March 2022 statement, they expanded it into a multidisciplinary clinic. And once I discovered this, I didn't believe it at all. It took me 6 months to really wrap my head around it. But once I saw the evidence myself, you know, from the lectures, from the meetings, that the directors of the transgender program, which supposedly didn't exist, were instituting these institution-wide like algorithms to kind of funnel kids into the transgender clinic, I knew I had to blow the whistle. So it took me 5 months. I started reaching out to journalists in like January of 2023, but most of the journalists I got in contact with just didn't believe it or ignored me because it was too crazy for them to believe, or it was just too controversial. But I finally got a hold of Christopher Rufo in May of 2023. And he heard the story, he verified that what I was saying was true. And the story came out May 16th, 2023, and I was the anonymous whistleblower. I wanted to preserve my anonymity at all costs because I'm a very private person by nature. And the story came out May 16th, 2023. And it was actually 24 hours later, on May 17th, that the Texas Senate voted to pass SB 14, which was the law that banned transgender interventions in children. And it was passed with bipartisan support. And the reason it passed with bipartisan support was partially because our story had come out the day before, because there were Democrats who had no idea that this was happening in their districts in Houston. And there were physical copies of Chris Rufo's story handed out to each member of the Texas Senate on the day of the vote. So, I was told by people who were there, by the people who were voting themselves, that the story had an impact.
Your wife has referred to this as an awkward position to be in and says, I find the prosecution against my husband in a lot of ways to be outrageous and disappointing as someone who works at the Justice Department. Forgive me, but it sounds like your better half saved your ass. Let's get into the details of the case in a second. Can you talk about the effects of this Kafkaesque experience on you and your family? And may I ask how your family is doing?
Yeah, of course. It was a month after the story came out. in June of 2023 that federal agents first came to my home. So like the effects this had on my family, like the most immediate effect was on June 23rd, 2023, the day of my graduation from surgical training, one of the most important days of my life, right? Federal agents come to my home a few hours before the graduation ceremony, right? And it's my belief that they chose that day for a very specific reason, because they were trying to intimidate me. And so I answer the door, I invite him in, I kind of freak out, I didn't know what to do. And they kind of pulled out a tripod and they were going to do an interview with me. And um, uh, thankfully, my wife came out and she sits down and she kind of gives me this look and she's like, "Hey, we shouldn't talk about this more in our room." So we walk away, we go in our bedroom, and she tells me that, yeah, you should not speak with these agents without an attorney present. And then we go back out to our dining room table, which is where they were, and I tell them to pretty much go screw off, and I'm not going to talk to them. But before they leave, they hand me a target letter that said I was a potential target of a criminal investigation, and it was signed by a prosecutor in the Southern District of Texas. So that was the day I found out I was being targeted, for criminally targeted by the United States Department of Justice. And after that, I mean, it was like my entire life, my entire family had been thrown into like an alternative universe because my wife had just been hired as a assistant U.S. attorney, a federal prosecutor. That's what that position is in the Northern District of Texas in Dallas. And we had no idea how this was going to affect her job. And luckily, Christopher Rufo had put us in contact with an amazing attorney. Her name is Marcella Burke. She's like more than just a lawyer. She's like our guardian angel. But she sets up a team of lawyers who are brilliant. And on the first call between my attorneys and the Department of Justice, um, the prosecutor threatens my wife, uh, threatens her job at the DOJ because she just got hired and was undergoing a background check. So she said that, uh, my wife had been obstructing this investigation and she's not going to have any problems with her background check unless she, quote, continues to become difficult, right? So if that's not a threat, I don't know what is. But for the next 6 months, right, I tried to fight this whole thing and anonymously, right? I didn't want to take my name public, but we were hemorrhaging all of our finances at the time. We had like $250,000 saved up because both me and my wife were like very, frugal spenders. We save all of our money. So we had a good amount of money saved up. We were planning on, using that for a down payment on a home and, to start a family. But we had burned through all that money in about 4 months through legal costs. And during those 6 months between June of 2023 and January 2024, we had realized that the corruption was just so, so deep because over the next couple of months, the DOJ, what they're telling my attorneys is just crazier and crazier, right? The first call, they threatened my wife. Then they said they were in contact with the families of these transgender kids and that they're going to sue me if I avoid, criminal charges, right? And that's crazy. You can't do that as a prosecutor, right? And there was a bunch of other things that uh, were outlined in a letter my attorney sent to Congress, kind of detailing this corruption. But the one thing that had compelled me to take my story public and really kind of blow up my entire life was when the DOJ told my attorneys that, we're going to take Dr. Haim to trial, even if we're going to lose, even on a technicality. And that told us that this was not about justice, right? They were investigating me. They were going to prosecute me in order to destroy my life. because any prosecutor, they can only take the cases they believe they're going to win in court. And we knew this because my wife was a prosecutor, right? It's like clearly in the DOJ handbook, you can only prosecute someone if you believe that they're actually guilty of a crime. And what they were telling us is that they were going to take me to a trial, even on a case that had no merit, only to punish me. And and that's when I knew I had to take my story public because they were going to destroy me. We were totally broke. We had lost everything. And that's when I decided to take my story public in January 2024. And yeah, that's really kind of when things spiraled out of control.
You had not disclosed the name of any patients. You had not given Christopher Rufo any personally identifiable medical information that was protected by federal law under HIPAA.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
you had given Rufo diagnoses and brief treatment summaries, and
Mhm.
these kids were getting puberty blockers inserted, but you stripped out the names, the birth dates, the other identifying information. And then you're reading this indictment against you, and you're being told that basically this is about us just wanting to punish you. So, how exactly are they constructing charges against you? My understanding is that they were charging you with having revealed the name of a doctor, for example.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's um it's truly hard to believe. Um what I'm about to tell you is true, but I can assure you it's true. It's all public, but this is how it worked. So, to start off with, the information I had given to Christopher Rufo, um, it's like the billboard information that hospitals frequently release to um, uh, media organizations like news channels about like public health and data from a hospital. So, for example, during COVID, hospitals would release information to a news organization saying, we had this many cases of COVID between the ages of this and that. And the whole reason is, right, it's a public health issue. So in HIPAA, there is a whistleblowing statute that allows doctors to blow the whistle if they see something that is obviously wrong. So, and that even includes if it includes patient data. None of what I had released included any identifiable patient information. Zero, none. And the DOJ had to concede that. So this was the first time HIPAA was being used to charge someone, even though no identifiable patient information had been released. It was the first time in history that HIPAA was used to charge someone, and the claim was not that a patient was harmed, but rather the hospital and the doctors were harmed. And you'll find that pretty odd because HIPAA is meant to protect patients, not multi-billion dollar hospital systems and doctors who lie to the public, right? In the indictment themselves, it said that, from the first indictment to the second and third indictment, right, they took out patients and then switched it to doctors in the hospital. Um, and that's kind of what the charge was eventually. But what's really revealing is what they initially charged me with. They had claimed that I had no reason to be a TCH, that I had lied about getting access to the TCH medical record system in order to access patient information. Um, so that first indictment came out in June of 2024, and they had detailed all of their charges, and they had called me a liar. It said I had deceived the hospital, that I had released and disclosed patient information. But that entire story that they painted was completely false. And it only took my lawyers a few weeks, right, to prove that everything they said in their indictment was a complete fabrication. And we knew it was a fabrication because the evidence that the Department of Justice gave us in discovery, right, had disproved every single allegation in their indictment. And it's worth restating that. The Department of Justice's own evidence disproved their own allegations. So how is it possible that the Department of Justice had charged me with these crimes, right? The way they kind of excused themselves is they said that their knowledge of the evidence evolved. So they just kind of wrote it off. They're like, oh, well, sorry, we screwed up, right? We got our first indictment wrong. Everything is false. Let's just call that a mulligan and move on. They had to scrap their first indictment and come out with a second indictment, right? And even in their second indictment, they charged me with a crime that didn't exist, right? Like statutorily, like the crime they had accused me of was obtaining medical information, but I had access to the medical record system, so that's not a crime. So it's like it didn't even apply, but also in like the statute, there's nothing that says you can't obtain medical information. So the second indictment was completely dead on arrival. But not only that, they left a critical typo in their indictment. The statutes they had written in the legal document, right, in their indictment, they wrote subchapter XL, right? But there is no subchapter XL of like Title 42 or whatever, right? It doesn't exist. It was a typo. So it's like they cited you can't charge someone with a crime that doesn't exist, you know? So then that indictment falls apart. And then in the third indictment, we don't even know what I'm being charged with, right? My lawyers didn't know how to defend me because we didn't know like what the charges were. You know, it was complete mystery to us. And what's even crazier is that the first charge, charge one, the first felony, which is the most important one, is uh, which serves as the basis for charges two, three, and four. Most people don't even know that it had nothing to do with transgender patients. It had to do with transplant surgery patients, like transplant, like kidney and liver transplant. And so like when they had their press release, they had said that I had accessed patient information, which was true, but it wasn't transgender patients, it was transplant patients. But then you have to ask yourself, why would a chief general surgery resident at Baylor College of Medicine access surgical transplant patients, right? It's because I share a break room with the transplant surgery team, right? We rotate very, very frequently with the transplant team. The transplant surgeons ask chief residents to help cover for the surgeries all the time. The transplant patients at TCH were like 200 feet away, 300 feet away from like our break room where I was rotating at the time, you know? In the Baylor College of Medicine handbook, it clearly states that chief general surgery residents are responsible for every single patient in their physical vicinity, which included pediatric transplant patients. So it kind of goes back to what I said before. The prosecutors had told my attorneys before I went public that they were going to prosecute me on a technicality, even if they were going to lose, right? All of these things are the technicalities that they were prosecuting me on, right? And this was the basis of it. And it didn't only require the prosecutors to be complicit because it was the entire system of justice that had failed to hold the DOJ accountable because it was every single level that had failed. And it's like, how can a criminal defendant go through a prosecution when we have no idea what I'm being charged with what their basic argument is?
If there's one thing that we have learned through this podcast, that we have established beyond all doubt, it is the intersectional nature of Kafka with Orwell every time the state enforces gender woo as policy. Not only are there multiple filings for, quote, significant errors in the first filing, then there's the second filing, and you're being accused of having a personal agenda, and you were accused of grossly mischaracterizing and wrongfully disclosing the hospital's procedures, which sounds a lot like Frankly, it sounds a lot like a laptop, a Hunter Biden laptop, right?
Yeah.
It's misinformation, where you're just being dismissed as misinformation. They were clearly trying to cover for the hospital in that first indictment. Then the second indictment is a farce. Then the three government lawyers and Judge Hittner still find an erroneous citation. And he says, who's proofreading? Who's
Well,
proofreading?
it was us who found that erroneous citation. We had to do the work for them, and it was so the first indictment, and this is kind of how they do it, right? In the first indictment, they wrote that I had disclosed um, personally identifiable information of patients and doctors, right? So that was the language they used. I had disclosed personally identifiable patient information personally identifiable information of patients. So the key operational language is disclose and personally identifiable information of patients, right? So the first indictment falls apart because it wasn't true. So when you compare like a side-by-side comparison of the first indictment to the second indictment, right? They drop the word disclose, right? It goes from disclose to obtain, right? But those are two very different things. Like disclose is a crime, obtain is not a crime, right? And then the second part, when you do a side-by-side comparison, right? It's not personally identifiable information. It's just information, right? So they took out the first part, which is like the personally identifiable. And then the third part is they took out patients instead of uh like it was with the intention of harming patients and the doctors. They changed it to with the intention of harming doctors and TCH. So every step of the way, it just got more and more insane, where you don't think it could possibly get even crazier, but it does. Like, and the whole reason for the first indictment, like crafting the first indictment in that way, is because it allows the media to create this false narrative about you, right? It makes you look like a criminal. So you have the New York Times, the Washington Post, uh, NPR, the Houston Chronicle, the Texas Tribune. They can cite the indictment and say he's alleged to have released personally identifiable patient information of pediatric patients. But all of that was completely untrue because the indictment completely fell apart, which is why they had to change it and remove any mention of patients, right? So the second and third indictment had no mention of patients, right? It was only the doctors in the hospital. And this is very telling because if you think about it, in what situation would a hospital ever have to conceal what they're doing to a patient, right? What interest would a hospital have in doing that? Because if a hospital and the doctors there are taking care of patients and it's the right thing to do, they should have no problem with that being public. The fact that they wanted to keep it a secret is revealing that they knew what they were doing was wrong. Because there's nothing a doctor does to a patient that they should be unwilling to defend publicly. And if they're not willing to defend it publicly, if they have to conceal it, then it's very likely that what they're doing is very wrong.
On top of this farce, the prosecutor's involvement is questionable in the first place. I believe her license had expired at one point, and the Department of Justice ultimately filed a motion, I believe, to withdraw this prosecutor from the case because the conflict of interest was, frankly, embarrassing. Your attorneys pointed out that her family members, quote, have substantial financial and political ties to Texas Children's, which they argue raises serious ethical questions. I realize that you can't flesh that out because there are things going on. But I just have to say that this story would not be complete without at least a whiff of self-dealing. Kafka and Orwell must meet corruption every single time. It has to be the good, the bad, and the ugly. Can you say anything, or is there anything you would like to say about that aspect of this case?
Yeah. And it's the Department of Justice is supposed to be the ones who flesh out these conflicts of interest, right? So like this was being tried in the Southern District of Texas. Each state is broken up into multiple districts, and each district, are the ones who prosecute the crimes in their district. So it's the Southern District of Texas that is supposed to identify these conflicts of interest. But who identified the conflicts of interest? It was me, right? I I had been tipped off to something, and it was me who went down this rabbit hole and discovered all this, and we had to bring it up to them. And it was only after we brought up these profound conflicts of interest that the lead DOJ prosecutor had stepped down, and it was there there was no reason given, but we assume that was a reason because it was right after. But what I will say about it is, I'll give you a hypothetical, kind of like imagine if a whistleblower at a tobacco company, right, spoke out, and or a pharmaceutical company, right, and it turns out that that whistleblower gets prosecuted. And what would you think if in the months or the whistleblower is investigated and then prosecuted? What would you think if in the month, 2 months, and 3 months after that whistleblower is being investigated, if the lead prosecutor in that case, if her brother started making significant financial contributions to that pharmaceutical company, right? Wouldn't that be a little bit suspicious? Right after, the month after an investigation has started, the prosecutor's brother is making donations to that pharmaceutical company. And then not only that, but the prosecutor's uncle was on the board of that pharmaceutical company. And then not only that, the prosecutor's aunt was appointed to the board of one of the sister pharmaceutical companies. And they were appointed to the board of that sister pharmaceutical company at the same time as the lead counsel who was involved in the initial investigation of the main pharmaceutical company, right? The conflicts would go so deep, it would be stranger than fiction. But if you type in Google, you type in my name and then Kendall Tietz, KENDALL TIETZ, Fox News conflicts of interest, you'll see an article from Fox News when that story broke. And if you go to the middle of the article, you'll see this crazy conflict map. It's like a diagram that I had laid out of all of the conflicts of interest, and you can see for yourself. Um, so it's to get an idea of how much corruption there is. You can all you have to do is look at that, and it's just one more thing in like an entire mountain of misconduct, right? Where it's like you hear a story like this and you think, is this still the United States? Like like people look at places like Russia or North Korea or China and think that their people over there get destroyed for speaking out against the government. But I would argue that over the past 4 years under the Biden regime, that it was just as bad here. I mean, it it it, it's hard to even fathom how corrupt it was.
Judge David Hittner of the Southern District of Texas signed an order dismissing the charges with prejudice. That means the government can never come after you again over this. But you still deal with the consequences. For example, at your job now. I don't know if you heard my podcast with Jamie Reed 2 weeks ago. It will be unlocked at the time this podcast is posted for premium subscribers. And I asked her about the Moscow rules that CIA agents had to learn for clandestine service during the Cold War. I'm just going to recap those rules for you so you can see if this sounds familiar. You cannot assume anything. You have to trust your instincts. You should assume everyone you meet is under enemy control. Assume that you are being tracked and followed at all times. Blend in. Be seen to go with the flow. Lull the enemy into complacency. Don't antagonize the enemy. Stay flexible. Vary your patterns and create a moment when you are free to act. That's essentially how the Moscow rules work. Does any of that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, yeah. Um, and those rules apply in the sense of like if you're someone working within like the Soviet system, how to fight against it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I would say there is no better description of what I went through than that because even before I blew the whistle, the code of silence in my training program was was so severe it's hard to describe. I mean, if you said anything that was outside of like the political dogma, then you would be vilified and suffer severe repercussions. Like, for example, there were trauma patients who would come in after being shot and they would put masks on them, right? Which is the craziest thing you could ever do. Is someone who just got shot in their chest and to put a mask on them. It's very dangerous. I had spoken out against that. I said, this is insane. We should not do this. And I almost got fired for it. Um, but there was only a select number of people, maybe like two or three people in my program, about 80 people who I was actually felt safe to talk with, right? About like everything that was happening around us. And we would actually meet in dark corners. Like it's not something these weren't opinions that we can express openly because we knew that the repercussions were so significant. So we had to have like, we were like in like this underground and there was very few of us and all of us felt so isolated because we felt like we were living in this alternate reality. And as you kind of move through this environment, that's when I had discovered this thing about Texas Children's and they were lying about their transgender program. And it's exactly like according to those rules. I had to act when the moment was right. Once I saw an opportunity, I had to do something. And they had used every technique possible to try to punish me for it because afterwards, like in the beginning part of the investigation phase, I assumed that my phone was being tapped, my text messages were being read, my email was hacked into. And it was only after a couple of weeks that I was notified that yes, the government had hacked into my Apple accounts, were reading my text messages, my emails, probably listening to all of my phone calls. So yeah, it was the world of like this Soviet totalitarianism that we read about in books was the world that I lived in for like 3 years.
Senator Josh Hawley invited you to President Donald Trump's address to a joint session of Congress in March as a guest of honor. And I've met you twice in D.C., first at D-Trans Awareness Day, and then again at the Federal Trade Commission workshop. My sense is that the president and the Republican Party take this issue seriously. May I ask, what was your political journey? Where were you in, say, just before 2020, like 2019 versus 2026? What is that journey for you?
I would say I think it's probably worth starting a little bit earlier because I was, in my teens, early 20s, I was like a pretty far left. Um, you know, my parents were pretty conservative, but of course, there's this natural rebellious phase that you go through when you're young. Um, so, and plus, everything in the culture, right, was left wing. Even if you didn't know it, all the left-wing messaging was there. So because it's the water you swim in, those are the politics you adopt. But during college, I had started to wake up to like the double speak, right? The small variations in language that the left uses. And it was around, 22, 23 years old that I had changed my party affiliation, became a Republican. But even then, I was kind of like your general milk toast, Paul Ryan, you know, Republican. In 2016, I thought Trump was awful. I didn't vote for him. And I realize now that it was because had bought into the propaganda from the mainstream media about Trump, right? Everything they said, I had just swallowed it wholesale without thinking. But then after I saw how he governed from 2016 to 2020, um, you know, that had changed my mind significantly because I saw the effects of what a Trump administration had on our country. And even though most of that first time he was president, he was being sabotaged by the deep state, so many things had gotten better that, I voted for him in 2020. But before COVID, my political stance was still kind of like a milquetoast Republican. I had never believed in these conspiracies about, these globalist organizations conspiring to, you know, um, uh, exert their control over individual countries and subverting the sovereignty of the nation state, right? I had never even thought that was possible. I had always dismissed it as as nonsensical, right? Like my views on mainstream medicine was that, mainstream medicine for the most part is trustworthy, it's legitimate. The doctors are operating free of conflict, but before and after COVID, it couldn't be any different, right? It was like everything I had ever believed turned out to be false. And I had to rediscover everything for myself. I had to, go to the primary sources. I had to do the research for myself. I couldn't just take things at face value. I had to do the work on my own in order to know what was true and what was not.
You've become a tireless advocate for shutting down the pediatric practice of gender medicine. But what is your take on adult gender medicine now that you've had this time to look at it?
Well, I would say it's no different than my view on the pediatric gender medicine. The whole field is based on evidence that is fabricated and fraudulent. But even before that, right, whenever you have any field in medicine, before you talk about randomized controlled trials and evidence, there has to be logic to what you're doing to a patient, right? And the field of gender medicine does not even cross that threshold of basic logic because it doesn't make sense to use the most potent, powerful physiological interventions, right? Like puberty blockers, hormones, and radical surgery to treat something that in essence is a problem of the mind, right? So when you have a physiological problem, you use a physical solution, right? An example would be if you have appendicitis, you treat it with a physical solution like an appendectomy, right? You have this idea of gender dysphoria, which is a psychological problem, right? It makes no logical sense to treat it with powerful physical interventions, whether you're a child or you're an adult. Even if you're an adult and a doctor says these are the risks, right? And you sign a piece of paper that says I give my consent, that's not informed consent, right? Because the patient is being misinformed about the nature of what's being treated, right? When the doctors are misinformed about the pathology they're treating, then you can't call that informed consent. So both adults and children are being deceived. They're being harmed. So yeah, my view is the same. It's not justified in children, it's not justified in adults because there's no benefit. The job of a doctor is to restore health. The definition of health is naturally occurring physiology that allows a human to survive, number one, and then to thrive. If a doctor is doing something that alters the natural state of physiology, that reduces the ability of someone to thrive and survive, then that's not medicine. That's anti-medicine, right? And that's what this field is. So, in my opinion, it should be outlawed for both children and adults. Doctors who are doing this should be prosecuted for assault.
Ryan Patrick and Marcella Burke did a fantastic job defending you, but this was expensive. I understand that you raised more than $1 million, but you have something like 2 million in legal bills last I knew. So just for listeners to understand why that is, about a decade ago, so 2015 prices, I was quoted $25,000 for a single federal motion in a federal court. It is expensive to get prosecuted. So do you mind telling us how expensive and moreover, how much more expensive it remains for you?
Yeah, it's so it was Marcel Burke, Ryan Patrick, Mark Lytle, and Mark Lytle, he's amazing. He's the lawyer who represented the IRS whistleblowers in the Hunter Biden case. And then Jeff Hall, those you know those four people, they were more than lawyers. They were guardian angels for us. And I can't say enough for what they did to keep me free. But it was an amazing thing to be able to have them, but it came at a cost, right? And it's important to for people to understand this because there's a difference on the political left and the political right. On the political left, if you have a whistleblower or someone who gets into a legal bind, you're going to have all of the major law firms, like the really big wig, prominent law firms in the country that are going to line up to defend that person, right? So a good example is like Luigi Mangione, the scumbag who murdered this CEO of this healthcare company, right? You have pro bono lawyers who are going to represent this guy free of cost. Mahmoud Khalil, right? This guy from Colombia. You have lawyers lining up around the block to represent this guy free of charge. And these are the best lawyers in the country. On the other side, on the political right, you have whistleblowers like me. You actually, not only do you not have lawyers who will represent you, you have the structures in place in the legal profession to disincentivize lawyers from representing you. Because the lawyers who did take on my case, Marcella, Ryan, Mark, and Jeff, they faced significant risk from representing me because there's organizations that will target them, try to disbar them for taking my case, right? And plus, they know that there's going to be no organizations on the political right to help funding. So, like, we had a little bit of money, but they know that they're going to represent me, but that I'm not going to be able to pay them after a certain amount of time, which is what happened, which is why I took my story public because we were totally broke. And uh, uh, so every single thing you do with your lawyers is incredibly expensive. And when you're facing a federal criminal trial, you can't just get any lawyer. You have to have the best lawyers or else you're totally screwed. The conviction rate, if you go to trial in federal court, is like 99%, right? And most of the cases, even before they go to trial, the defendants will plead because they know they don't stand a chance, right? And if they do go to trial and they're found guilty, they know that the judge is typically going to be give you a harsher sentence if you're found guilty because it's kind of like payback. Like if you take the time and make everyone go through a trial, then they're going to be harsher on you, right? So it's a huge risk. And everything the Department of Justice did was to prolong this process, to make it as painful as possible, to make sure that my lawyers had to do the most amount of work so that we had to pay the most amount possible. So for example, like after the first indictment fell apart, and the DOJ had disclosed to us that you know the hospital TCH had given them evidence that disproved their entire first indictment. But when did they make my attorneys aware of that? It was Friday evening, 5:30 p.m., right? End of the workday. The Friday before the Monday where all of the pretrial motions were due. The last minute possible, the DOJ had informed my attorneys of like this bombshell disclosure that changed everything. And that Friday, my attorneys were finalizing their pretrial motions. And then once they finished at 5:30, they get this disclosure, which makes all of their work from the preceding couple of weeks completely pointless. So they had to work throughout the weekend, right, to rewrite every single motion to be ready for that Monday. So like just that week in itself was probably $50,000, $60,000. And yeah, that happened like a bunch of times, right? We had to fight tooth and nail to even get the most basic idea of what they were charging me with. And each hour is thousands of dollars. So in total, it was about $2.5 million. We were able to raise like one, it was maybe like a little bit less, maybe like a little bit over $2 million. We were able to raise like $1.35 million, which is, you know, something I would have never even dreamed of. And for all those people who donated, I'm forever, in debt for them donating to our cause, to our Give, Send, Go. So as of now, we still owe like a little bit over $500,000 in legal fees. And we're paying that off slowly over time. It was like $1 million a couple of months ago, but after the case was dismissed, we had a bunch of donations and it was really awesome. But like right now, yeah, we're still broke. We have about, for a surgeon and a lawyer, you know, we have like a couple $1,000s in our bank account, which is pretty unfortunate. But you know what? It's like the cost of that is worth it because to be able to fight back to win in a case like this is more important than any amount of money because um it's a cost well worth paying, and especially given the fact that during the most intense part of the prosecution my wife gave birth to our first child, and we knew that what we were fighting for was the future for our children and for our daughter, our newborn daughter, and that if we didn't fight, that we would just be delivering her into a world that was more dangerous. So like if we want to really give her a chance for a future, like to live in a country that is a just place, then we had to sacrifice everything. And if that meant me going to prison, then that meant me going to prison. But yeah, if anyone does want to donate, it's givesendgo.com/Texas underscore whistleblower. So givesendgo.com /Texas underscore whistleblower.
Dr. Eithan Haim, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for blowing this whistle. Dr. Eithan Haim, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for blowing this whistle.
Of course, it really is. It's a privilege to be able to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. The Distance is an encampment for everyone made politically homeless by gender ideology. Visit our website at www.thedistancemag.com to support our work with a monthly or annual premium subscription.